Hey folks, Nicholas here with an explanation of how what I call four-planar mathematics relates to my understanding of ontology in UTOK. Although this is a standalone presentation, it does also serve a goal of clarifying and contextualizing a previous presentation titled Consilience and Integration. So please do check that one out after this if you haven't already seen it. Now, certainly, in my view anyway, UTOK is for a large number of great things, sanity, clarity, and consilience being three that pop immediately to the top of mind. And I think it's also fair to say it's against some things, notably an ontological overreach of quote-unquote physicalism, and physicalism's epistemological flattening, or annihilation really, which Henriques has appropriately framed in terms of an anti-Noah stance. Now, there are many definitions of physicalism, so for definiteness, I offer one characterization here, in terms of seeing every behavior at every level in terms of a set of real valued numbers at the next future instant being entailed by a set at the present instance plus so-called physical law. Absent some remediable technical objections about the complex valued nature of quantum formalisms, and allowing that this kind of entailment need not dismiss the value of non-numeric explanations in disciplines such as chemistry and biology, I think this is a reasonable characterization of at least one form of physicalism, what I sometimes call strict physicalism. Now, a major theme in my work is criticism, actually, of historical philosophical isms such as physicalism. One problem is that these terms are multivalent. For example, there are at least 6 directly salient and radically different versions of physicalism. Another problem, and a devastating one often for serious inquiry, is that philosophical isms often enact centuries-old distinctions between different viewpoints, which can try to force modern, scientifically informed nuance into medieval boxes. Anyhow, setting that rant aside for the moment, I'm going to replace physicalism as a name for the stance described here with real valued fundamentals, computationalism. I explain why computationalism is a good ontologically general expression of modern science in the conciliation and integration presentation. So please take a look there again if you haven't seen that video. Now, the other thing I do on this slide, in addition to replacing physicalist nomenclature, is introduce UTOK's four-planar basic structure, which I'm going to assume you're familiar with, from the matter-object level at the bottom to the culture-person level at the top. Now, seen through a real valued fundamentals computationalism lens, which I'll abbreviate sometimes to RVFC, UTOK's various levels or planes are merely, but very helpfully, epistemological levels. That is, behavior at each level is still fully entailed by the same mathematical formalism, but it's helpful to use new language for each level. For example, in terms of biology for the organism plane, psychology and certain parts of neuroscience for the mind-animal level. Certainly, one potentially unfortunate consequence of the previous consilience and integration video, which I completely overlooked when I made it, was a take in which the formalism I introduced there was simply a sophisticated way to continue or deepen RVFC into the mind-animal plane. And that is not at all what I have in mind more broadly. And it's a major goal of this presentation to clarify that. Rather, my current working hypothesis is that there are 4 very different kinds of mathematics corresponding to UTOK's 4 planes, and that we can see these different mathematics as both instantiating in a formal way UTOK's qualitative sense of different ontologies or causal relations at each level, and correspondingly going beyond RVFC. RVFC is entirely appropriate for the matter-object level, but not as the sole mathematics or ontology of higher levels. So very briefly, if RVFC doesn't suffice for higher planes, what does? First, at the life organism level, there's already a fully worked out, incredibly sophisticated, and just unbelievably neglected mathematics due to the Canadian biophysicist Robert Rosen. His metabolism, reproduction, repair, or MRR, characterization of a living system leads logically to an expansion of RVFC phase space approaches into a vastly larger mathematics based on what are called functors, essentially mathematical functions that transform one function into another instead of, as is more typically we're more familiar with, one number into another. Rosen, correctly in my view, firmly distinguishes between true complexity, which necessarily involves functors, and mere complication, which is what almost all of so-called complexity theory or complex adaptive systems approaches currently describe. As mind-blowingly extraordinary as Rosen's work is for life, he steers clear of phenomenal consciousness or consciousness 2/mind 2 in UTOK terminology. Although another terrific part of his work does deal with anticipatory systems, which are an important aspect of UTOK's Mind 1. The minimal mathematical extension beyond Rosen, then, at the Mind 2 level, is my work on qualia-valued information and qualia-valued emergence or contingent instantiation, abbreviated here as QVCI. C, dagger, sub B are conditions C on the brain B for the instantiation dagger of angle brackets labeled phenomena, i.e. qualia-valued information. Additionally, we need both a theoretical statement of an interaction Hamiltonian H int, allowing for qualia-valued information to couple onto the conventional matter-energy brain, and an empirical way, notably via what I call the one experiment, to show that such an H int actually corresponds to an actual coupling in the actual world. Okay, that's a lot of very condensed technical verbiage, but it's all developed much more slowly in the highly recommended now consilience and integration presentation. So next up, literally, is the culture and person plane. Is the culture person plane. Well, the mathematical proliferation there is definitely work in progress for me, but my current intuition, as I'll explain, is it will have something to do with foregrounding various kinds of non-algorithmic computation, NA-comp. Okay, now let's revisit entailment. Here, the computability of the next state from the current one, as addressed in the middle column. So starting at the matter-object level, to be more precise, quantum dynamics aren't fully entailed by Hamiltonian formalism because, apart from in a many worlds interpretation, there's a random so-called wave function collapse. So let's then track the entailed, unentailed mix up through the levels. In Rosen's work, there is an unentailed dynamic in the shift of the organism between metabolism, repair, and reproduction configurations. So unentailment, so to speak, has escaped, so to speak, from imprisonment in the particle level and made it to the organismic scale. Then, at the mind level, there's minimally the fact that qualia-valued information couples with or affects the matter brain, which can be thought of as another dilution of entailment of reals by reals, because now we have real and qualia-valued information entailing real and qualia values. Also at this level, though, it's a little complex. I'm not going to get into it here. It's somewhere from plausible to likely that the non-algorithmic computation conjectured at the culture person level is also starting to peek out and act within Mind 2. For example, if Mind 2 evolved rather than arising as some incredibly unlikely accident, it must enact some fitness relevant computation. And non-algorithmic computation is one leading candidate for that. Then, at the culture person level, there's this definitively much more speculative conjecture that behavior is or can be maximally unentailed in one way of looking at things in the form of non-algorithmic computation. So what is NA-comp as abbreviated? on the right here. Well, long story, but one much vaunted example class concerns certain forms of mathematical insight that, at least in a certain context, can't be derived mechanically by any contextually available algorithm. Now, Roger Penrose famously made an argument relating NA-comp with quote-unquote consciousness, which leads to another long story about how this work is absolutely not a version of Penrosian logic. And so, just to summarize that story, Penrose was trying to stuff both unentailment, quantum unentailment, and creativity, and poorly defined consciousness into a conventional RVFC framework. And wave function collapse is the only RVFC available place to do that stuffing. So that's where Penrose put it. Now here, in contrast to Penrose, RVFC only pertains to the MO level, and the mathematics expands with each step up, so that life, mind, and culture each have their own characteristic innovation in mathematical description corresponding to behavioral novelty at each level. In summary, no stuffing required. Okay, having strongly disambiguated this work from Penrose's, it is true that he was onto something, a pointer to the fact that human creativity plausibly includes a non-algorithmic component. In fact, you'll notice that the middle column, here refers to non-algorithmic creativity, while the right-hand column refers to computation. So one way of thinking about the different kinds of unentailment in the middle column is, in fact, as different kinds of creativity. The most creative nature can be, so to speak, at the quantum level, is to randomly appear over here rather than over there. As we rise up through the levels, though, creativity or unentailment can take different forms, each arguably occurring at a larger scale, from particles to bodies, to the conscious scene, to a cultural milieu. And in the title here, I wax a little poetic, calling this movement the lifting of creativity up and out from a sort of imprisonment within quantum randomness into cultural play. But of course, in UTOK, there's also a sort of basement level below matter object as, an information energy ground. Now here I give one conjectural sketch of some of the explicit elements of that ground, pointing out three different kinds of information: real valued, qualia valued, and another order of information that encapsulates minimally the different kinds of mathematics pertaining to the four-planar levels. Then I further add the term creative to energy. Although this is a very blunt sketch, I could differentiate between raw energy and creative energy, very, very crudely and analogically speaking, as illustrated, kind of, by the difference between raw as the peaceful, single-pointed flow of a river, and creative as that river's turbulent, chaotic phases. Although the latter isn't actually technically creative in the current sense, because it's thought by current physics to be algorithmically computable. Anyway, the main point or picture I want to make with this is then to speculate that the creative energy lifts the mathematical structures up and out of the ground, and these structures then govern behaviors of real and qualia valued degrees of freedom, amongst others. So this is a somewhat dynamic process, or can be interpreted that way. If we imagine this lifting up of various onto-mathematical levels as a movement that's actually happening in some sense over billions of years in our universe. Now, at this point, we've come a very long way from our opening RVFC version of physicalism. We have expanding non-entailment at various levels, which means while science might be able to tell us, for example, the different MRR configurations an organismic body can take, can take. It can't tell us what shifts will actually happen from moment to moment any more than it can tell us, which slit the electron is going to go through in a quantum level experiment. Then there's another sort of non-entailment that I haven't mentioned yet, and it's really on the epistemology side, not the ontological, which is the focus of this presentation. But I should just mention it. The reference or signifieds in the natural world of the angle bracket symbols or signifiers, that the signifieds are not entailed, defined, or predicted by any part of all of this descriptive inferential machinery shown here. So, for example, although we might be able to map the neural olfactory response to blue cheese, say, and predict there is a conscious experience correspondingly, what the smell is actually like is a first-person experiential issue. Okay, so it might be tempting to stop here, and we could actually, if you like. The content so far is a standalone introduction to four-planar mathematics. Although, one thing we should definitely do before stopping is to contextualize four-planar mathematics as just one of many justification systems at the culture person level, albeit one with unusual range and precision. Now, of course, if the letters and colored symbols on the left are meant to stand in for reality itself, then UTOK is also a justification system. Now we start to get into map territory and self-reflexive considerations that I won't pursue here, but are often important in mathematical consistency. Now, should we stop here? Well, again, we could. But if our specific terrestrial context is metacrisis, and our specific purpose in relation to that context is timely and effective response, I'd suggest there's one big piece we could naturally continue into here, which is the absence, denial, or overlooking, even in the four-planar maths just described, of what I will call living movingness. Now, to illustrate what I mean by this, consider a set of static pictures of a dancer capturing her pose at a succession of time instants, and contrast that with the moving presentation of those same images. Both forms, static and moving, contain the same information conceptually. Maybe the moving image needs to have a clock in it, technically. But it's clear one has something the other does not: the actuality of movingness. Now, crucially, fundamental movingness has a profound relationship with time, and its introduction leads to novel intuitions, for example, about the behaviors of clocks in special relativity. But that's way off the central theme here right now, which is to take this picture, whose basic structure we saw before we started the context-purpose discussion, and then amend it to bring in movingness. So here I've just slightly amended the version of the picture we had before to emphasize that in four-planar mathematics so far, these descriptions in the right-hand rectangle would typically take the form of static time-indexed snapshots. And now here in the middle rectangle, I've reintroduced something we saw much earlier: the different modes or channels or kinds of for creative expression at various levels. Although I'd say these channels, these levels, can also admit simple, pure movingness, what I call raw movement, as opposed to creative form. So these green arrows stand for the emergence of movingness from the ground into these various channels, and then into animating the otherwise static numbers and symbols so that now they move. Okay, here finally we have a first pass complete picture of ground, four-planar mathematical formalisms, the time-indexed numbers and other mathematical objects that might describe a given instant, plus the putting into specific local motion of these symbols by the universal movingness emanating from the ground. Okay, so now I'm going to take a brief diversion into what physicalist scientists would definitely consider woo-woo unscientific territory. And I'm going to use a definition of the masculine principle in terms of the space that structures movement, and a feminine principle in terms of the movement structured by that space. So returning to the river analogy, we could identify the banks as the masculine and the flowy, peaceful, or turbulent movement with the feminine. Of course, riverbanks aren't space per se. That's why it's an analogy, not an identity. So what does this have to do with four-planar mathematics or UTOKian ontology? Well, we can identify the relatively static mathematics of various planes with the masculine, and the actual movingness of mathematically described entities as the feminine. For example, in quantum mechanics, again, there are two movements, the orderly raw evolution of the wave function, and then a random or creative collapse. Now here, I'm singling out and emphasizing the creative aspect of the feminine at various levels, from wave function collapse to the birthing of new images and movements, because that changes across level. But note also, which I've emphasized by reintroducing the plus symbol on the structure side, that masculine structure also grows as we ascend from plane to plane. Okay, now let's get back to real valued fundamentals computationalism as a version of masculine structure. It's the modernist, materialist, monolithic version. And this monolith is a collapse of the fourfold differentiated masculine. Correspondingly, on the feminine side, there's a restriction of the feminine creative movement solely to the random aspect of wave function collapse. All right. With this masculine-feminine woo, if you like, in hand, let's get back to central scientific considerations. So in one view, the totality of the transformation of science problem, if we buy four-planar mathematics, is the shift from the monolithic real-valued fundamentals computationalism here to this expansive differentiated four-planar view. But, and here's one reason I went woo, a larger version of the transformation problem is not just to expand the monolith into a four-planar version, but also to recognize and reintroduce movement, both orderly and creative, as actual feminine expressions. Now, we could see the movement from monolithic to four-planar mathematical structure as the healing and undoing of masculine collapse. And then a consequent recognition of the feminine as the movement of, in, and across mathematical levels, as a restoration after the repression of the feminine by that monolithic misapprehension of the masculine. And as I'll point out at the very end, we can relate masculine-feminine dynamics here to another of UTOK's concerns and a meta-crisis issue, the reconciliation and transcendence of modern versus postmodern conflicts. Okay, setting aside again for a moment what some may see as unscientific masculine-feminine frames, and returning to the first problem, the first stage of the transformation of science. Well, the overall shift is clear. The question is what to do to engender this shift and when, in the sense of what is the sequential order of steps. Now, in one view, it sure seems natural that what we should do is first move up from the real valued computationalist view of the matter-object plane and expand science's view of the life organism realm immediately above it. And then it seems like the second natural ordering would be to move from life organism to mind animal. But the state of affairs on the ground, in my view at least, is that the actual next step should be first to instantiate a more accurate model of the mind-animal plane, in particular of mind-II. Now, why is that? Well, mainly because the culture of physics, what we're trying to change, calls for rigorous data for any radical expansion of RVFC. And the data most imminently available right now concerns mind-II and consciousness-II. This data comes from what I call the one experiment, as described in consilience and integration. But the imminent availability of one experimental data at mind-II level isn't the only reason to prioritize this plane. Okay, the other is that what I call as-is natural science, or ANS, is already opening to the concept of qualia valued data, although not in the precise angle brackets formulation that I use. This opening is evidenced by a recent Nature paper comparing two leading theories of phenomenal consciousness. Now, ANS currently denies the H-int term that's required for any consistent or physics consilient approach to P consciousness. So its openness is half-baked at least, or a tragic desecration of scientific rigor, more realistically. But taking the glass half full view, half-baked is halfway to a theoretical opening. So that half is the other pragmatic reason to prioritize mind-II over the life organism plane right now. Now, on either side of what I call ANS, there are two conceptions, other conceptions of natural science. To the left, we have what Henriques calls modern empirical natural science, or MENS, which I believe is at least roughly equivalent to the real valued fundamental computationalist stance I've been using throughout here. And then to the right, what I call FUNS, or future natural science. For the moment, I'm just focusing on, again, on the masculine structure piece and not looking at the restoration of feminine movingness. But even the movement from MENS to ANS to FUNS is a daunting project. Okay, finally, I want to put the FUNS view together with relatively rigid mathematical masculine entailment on the one hand, and free creative feminine expression on the other. And I'm doing this in part to counterbalance a view that the four-planar version of future mathematically expressed natural science might just be a sort of repetition of the modernist monolith in a slightly more differentiated form, and trying to recapture, as it goes up, the totality of reality in rigid predictability after and despite discarding the monolith. So here, I counteract that mistaken conception of FUNS by graphing, somewhat schematically, the proportion of reality that's entailed by mathematical predictability, together with the counterbalancing proportion that's able to move in free creativity. So at the bottom, now in the MO level, here, I emphasize the classical view, not the quantum view. And in the classical view, there's zero freedom. Everything's mechanical. And then, in contrast, at the top, admittedly, in a view of some imaginary future culture in which it's possible to embody pure creativity, there is, or can be, 100% freedom in creative expression of a being using matter objects, the organismic body, and qualia in mind-II as metaphorical paint on the spatial canvas of life. The point here is, although mathematics does expand in a consistent way as you rise up the levels, that doesn't propagate imprisonment in predictability or entailment to the totality of reality. To the contrary, this picture recapitulates something we saw earlier, the planar hierarchical expansion of available ontologies, as broadening the expression of free creativity, as opposed to its repression under the inappropriately sort of land-grabbing, real-valued fundamentals computationalism. Okay. In summary, then, the thematic content has been to start to relate UTOK's differentiated ontology with what I'm calling four-planar mathematics. And while this articulation has its own great intrinsic value, in my view, another primary motivation for the specific form of this video has been to contextualize the consilience and integration presentation from before in three main ways. First, by clarifying that consilience and integration is not an attempt to expand, protect, or defend real valued fundamentals computational science. Next, by clarifying that prior presentation is not a bypass of the life organism level. For example, an implicit claim that there's nothing ontologically new at that level. And finally, by clarifying that consilience and integration focuses on the mind-animal level of mind two, simply because it offers the most likely near-term data required by physics culture and a half-open door theoretically, e.g. as exemplified by that recent Nature publication. Okay, and then some secondary goals. Actually, there's probably a lot more than this, but anyway, communicating the most expansive cross-connection between UTOK and my view of mathematics as description of ontology, seen as causal relations, albeit a partial description of those relations, because here we're also going to name this additional creative movement or creative energy factor or process as an expansion on those green arrows and the moving dancer and symbols, an expansion on the partial nature of currently typical mathematical formalisms. And then the last goal I'm going to touch on anyway is this view that modernism is more or less right about UTOK's matter object level. You know, RVFC is a good description there. But postmodernism is more or less right about, for example, repressive and limiting aspects of modernism's MO theory when it's expanded in that monolithic way to all levels. And that repression and limitation applies to both masculine and feminine principles. Okay, that's it for now. I hope you enjoyed this presentation. I certainly enjoyed finally getting some of this stuff on paper or on video, I guess. So one last thing, as much as this presentation has expanded, I hope, on ontological interpretations of consilience and integration, I probably need to make a third video giving some expansive epistemological takes. In any case, again, I'm Nicholas. Thanks so much for watching and hope we can connect again soon.